Good afternoon from a hot and stormy Johannesburg, and welcome to all of the people from around the world. I have been really amazed by the enormous number of people on this e-conference, and also the fact that you're spread around the world in all kinds of different time zones. So thank you for making the time, and thank you for being with us. My name is Bob Scholes. I was one of the co-chairs of the Land Degradation and Restoration Assessment, along with Luca Montanarella. Luca would have loved to join us this afternoon and shared this presentation, but he's somewhere in the air over Europe and sends his apologies. He will join the e-conference over the next couple of weeks. So I don't really need to explain to you what either IPBES is or the Land Degradation and Restoration Assessment was, but if you will show me the next slide, please. Very briefly, it was an exercise which involved a really large number of experts, both scientists and holders of traditional knowledge and local knowledge from many, many countries around the world. And it took us 3 years to evaluate about more than 4,000 publications from all kinds of knowledge bases. And then we wrote 3 drafts of the assessment, which were then commented on extensively by experts, by people such as yourself in the policy domain, in governments, and we incorporated all those comments into the final draft. And then at the IPBES 6th plenary, all the members of IPBES then interrogated our summary for policymakers line by line and came up with the final one. If you click again, perhaps it'll appear on the screen, which is that, and the full report is what you can reference if you want all the details on this assessment. So very briefly in the next few minutes, I'm going to touch on some of the very, very high level of the Land Degradation and Restoration Assessment. I'm going to have a little discussion about some of the things that we didn't say, not because we didn't want to say something about them, but because there simply wasn't sufficient information for us to make a balanced finding or a defensible finding is a basis for futures. And then finally, I will make some brief comments about what in my mind are some of the high priority issues for further research as revealed by the LDRA. Now, in the SBM, there is a table which touches on those, and I know that there will be a presentation by Judith just after me unpacking some of those. So I'm not going to go into them in a lot of detail. I'm going to just touch on the sort of highest level of, where we think the key gaps are. So moving on, please. Estelle, could you click? Thank you. So what these are the key findings is that land degradation world, it's in all kinds of ecosystems. It's in every country of the world. It's not just a question of in lands or in forests or in wetlands or in croplands. It can be found in all ecosystems. It's not somebody else's problem. It's a problem in your own backyard. And that's why we need to work collectively on it. Next, please. Estelle, could you move on, please? Of course, what the consequences of that land degradation are depends hugely on the context it occurs in, both in the social context. Is this a highly industrialized society or a very rural society? Is it a wealthy society or a poor society? Also the ecological context, what exactly are we talking about here? Is it loss of rangelands in a grassland, or is it loss of forests in a forest economy? It also depends on when that degradation occurred. Was it thousands of years ago, and so we've got used to that situation, or is it recent? But when taking all those factors into account, they are still in total, this degradation is a huge burden on human well-being. It's perhaps the biggest single contemporary issue in terms of its impact on people's lives. About 2 out of 5 people in the world have their well-being materially degraded by the fact that their landscapes are degraded. It is also amongst the top threats to the existence of other species, to biodiversity that we share the world with. Next slide, please. The bad news is, although that we have been aware of this problem for decades, and there are conventions and statements about what we should be doing about it, it's getting worse. It's not going away. And that is likely to continue to happen as the demands that we place on the natural world increases at the same time as its capacity to satisfy them decreases. Next slide. However, it's not all doom and gloom, because we also found in every ecosystem type in the world and in every part of the world examples of successful restoration. And not only is it technically possible to reverse some of the damage that we've done, but it is also economically viable to do that. Therefore, we can make a difference, but we're going to have to up our game substantially in order to achieve that. Next slide, please. So now, here are some of the things that we couldn't say, not because we didn't want to, but we just weren't able to do that. And perhaps the biggest elephant in the room is the perfectly reasonable question, just how much land degradation is there in the world? And although we've been studying this for decades, and there's hundreds of papers, thousands of pages of reports, we can't answer that simple question. And the basic problem is that in the past, we have had differing and incompatible definitions of degradation. So we can say for sure that degradation is occurring, but we can't simply add it up because one person's degradation is different from another person's degradation. So within the LDRA, we had the advantage is that we didn't have to argue about definitions. We were given a definition, and it goes a long way to addressing this problem. It basically says that it has to be a persistent decrease, not just a variation, in ecological function, ecosystems, and biodiversity. So that's a very operational kind of definition. It should form the basis for definitions in the future. But nevertheless, we have to look at two important things. The first is that you need to distinguish between transformation of ecosystems and degradation of ecosystems. They're both important processes, but transformation is when one ecosystem is replaced by another ecosystem, usually quite deliberately. In other words, we took a piece of grassland and we turned it into a cropland. We don't intend to turn that cropland back into grassland because we need it for growing crops. That's a transformation. A degradation is either in that original grassland, if we misuse it, it becomes a degraded grassland, or after we've transformed it, it can become a degraded cropland. And that's a different set of issues. So we need to separate those two out. And in many circumstances, we also have to treat the impacts on biodiversity separately from those on function and services, because you can get a situation where your function and your services are okay, but your biodiversity is heavily impacted, or even vice versa. And in those situations, you need to tease them apart and say, this is degraded with respect to its biodiversity, or with respect to its function, or with respect to its services. As a result, if we're going to make global comparisons in the future, every instance of degradation needs to be qualified by the following attributes. Firstly, we have to say, what is the type of degradation we talk about? Is it deforestation or forest degradation, wetland drainage, etc., etc.? There's many categories. Secondly, we need to say, what is the area affected? But we need to do it separately for different classes of severity. In other words, areas which are severely impacted, a great reduction in the ecosystem services. You need to count those separately from areas which might be very extensive but only mildly affected. And then we also need to be able to say, how quickly would this recover if we just stood back and let it recover by itself? Because obviously areas which may be quite severely affected but will recover within a few years, we would regard less seriously than areas which may be less impacted but will never recover unless we intervene ourselves. And so if in the future, when we do degradation research, we apply that kind of attribute scheme, we'll be in a much better position in the future. Next slide, please. So the emerging issues in my mind are as follows. Firstly, whenever you think about the research gaps around land degradation, you need to think about them in the context of all the other things going on around the world. What we found is that land degradation is central to many of the other concerns that we have around food security, around climate change, around biodiversity, around desertification, and that circle of colored squares is the Sustainable Development Goals. And our finding is that land degradation is directly and materially connected to half of the Sustainable Development Goals. It's in fact connected to all of them, but to half of them, it is an important factor. And if you press the advance again, if we look, for instance, at the Convention on Biodiversity Aichi targets, land degradation features explicitly in 4 of them. So when you think about what the research gaps are, think of the gaps not narrowly in terms of land degradation, but also in terms of these interactions with the other things that we care about. So next slide, please. So taking a very, very high level view, I think that some of the key research gaps are as follows. First is that our LDRA revealed the fundamental role which the relationship between people's worldviews, i.e. their value systems and the way they think about their environment and their perceptions of degradation. Why do some people think that one thing is degraded, whereas other people looking at the same situation don't think it's degraded, or if they think it's degraded, don't think it's a high priority to address it. This is fundamentally based on people's worldviews. What determines those worldviews? How are they changing over time? Next slide, please. Advance, please. Secondly, we really need to apply our mind to the way in which we bring in knowledge systems other than Western science. So IPBES is committed to this and is making a very serious effort in this area. We still don't pretend that we know how to do it or that it's easy. This is an exploration path for all of us, and we need to do research on how can we do that in a way which is non-domineering of any knowledge system over any other knowledge system, but at the same time also rigorous. We have to be able to ask questions of each other's knowledge basis, otherwise we don't have any basis for agreement. Next, please. And then finally, we did reveal that there is an association between land degradation, conflict, and migration, but we don't know what the causal relationship is. Which ones cause which ones? And in other words, if we are to intervene, where do we start our intervention? Do we have to do it as a package deal? Exactly how should we do this? This is a very important issue in the contemporary world, and we're unable to give really good intervention advice. At the moment, all we can do is flag that there is a connection between these things. We need to be in a better situation in the future. So that's the end of my presentation. I did not want to preempt the discussions over the next 3 weeks, because that's precisely why we're asking you for what your needs are and what your perceptions are. But here are some ideas coming from the co-chairs of the assessment at a very high level about what we think the important areas are. I wish you all well and look forward to interacting with you over the next couple of weeks. Cheers for now.